Who will lead the post-pandemic U.S. recovery? Small business entrepreneurs or big corporations? And really, is this even the right paradigm?
This should not be a conversation about going back to anything. This should be a conversation about how we take what we are learning about ourselves, about our economies, about our companies, and how do we forge a better future, a future that is more inclusive, a future that, as Nathalie says, brings everybody along with it, and we don't go back to where we were.
Before COVID, we did not have a functioning economy. We had unemployment levels and health outcomes, and especially health outcomes among communities of color, that were an embarrassment among first world nations. We had a wealth divide that was just as shameful, and I could go on, but I would say that unless you're one of the shrinking minority of people in this country who was not already in financial distress, there's no objective reason to want to return to the way that things were. What's needed is not really a recovery to a past state. What's needed is a healthy, thriving economy, the likes of which the U.S. has never seen.
So I would argue over the last 10 years, scale has been a disadvantage in many companies and many industries because it has caused those companies not to be able to react as fast as they needed to from a new competitor that came out of nowhere, that steals share from them, disrupts their model, and so on and so forth. But now there's an opportunity for scale really to be an advantage again.
To your question about who's going to lead, big corporate or small business entrepreneurs, I think the short answer for me is that it's our choice. And if we choose correctly, which in my opinion is choosing in favor of small businesses, it's going to be a battle every step of the way. Women start businesses at twice the rate of men in the United States, and 8.9 out of 10 of those are started by women of color. So by the numbers, when we talk about the future of small business, we're disproportionately talking about women of color.
Is competition between small business and established players a zero-sum game?
As I said, I don't think this is a zero-sum game. I don't think you can say one will be successful at the expense of the other. I mean, that has been the game to some degree up for the last 10 years, as I mentioned, in this era of disruption that we have, that has characterized the operating environment of most Fortune 500 companies, with well-funded, nimble, more creative, more diverse, more interesting, more consumer-centric startups coming in and completely disrupting their industries.
All I can think is, as I hear Brad talking, I kind of wish we had a bunch of clones of Brad in a lot of these C-suites, because it's idyllic to think of the relationship as symbiotic. I think it's a goal to aspire to. I'm not being romantic about small businesses. Small businesses can contaminate our water. They can, corrupt as well. But the reality is they're closer to the communities that they serve, and they have a higher likelihood of understanding what their communities actually need. And understanding the need of your customer goes to the point that Brad was making around where innovation begins.
When we look back in 3 years from now, what do you think will be the biggest differences between the 2020 recovery and the 2008 recovery?
The 2009 recession hit women of color the hardest. They were laid off the most. They had trouble getting back into the economy more than anyone else. And so it made them the demographic that was the slowest at recovering. So I guess for me, the bottom line is the fastest growing economic engine and the most entrepreneurial demographic in this country came into the current crisis deeply injured already and nowhere near recovered from the last economic downturn.
The single biggest difference between what happened in 2008 and what happened in 2020 is 750,000 people didn't die. I think the other big difference is it took 18 months between kind of 2007 to 2009 for the economy to really bottom out. In 2020, that happened in kind of a couple of weeks. But I think that as discretionary spending increases, we may see kind of us approaching that reset moment faster than it took for what was then called the recovery after 2008.
What variable or variables would you really want our audience to keep track of closely? Perhaps something that could vary widely and based upon what it turns out to be could result in all sorts of different conclusions and different outcomes for some of the things we've talked about.
Whether those in power, which is what big business interests represent, whether they're willing to cede some of that power for fairness and justice is a massive unknown. It's a risk, it's an assumption, right? And I would assume that they will not, which means a government elected by the people most impacted is going to have to step in. I think for me, the last thought with all of this is that we have two things that scale. We have big businesses that scale, and I think people forget that small businesses are the single most scalable way to deploy wealth creation, right? 90% of businesses are small and medium businesses. And big corporations do a lot of things well, but one of the things that they do really well is that they are really good at scaling wealth inequality and wealth concentration.
What has been reassuring to see from large companies, even before COVID-19, but I think it has accelerated, is the role large companies need to play in shaping the society that we want to live in. And I do think that as we move out of this kind of collective economic, social, and health crisis, I do really think, and I am optimistic, that large companies will now pivot to a place where they understand that their role in society is not just to make money, but to have a net positive impact, to bring people in all segments of the of society along with it.
Appreciate it, Brad. And I think that's a perfect way to wrap the last hour up all in a bow, which is that we're not all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm, but we're weathering it different boats. And I want to thank Nathalie and Brad for giving us so many perspectives from really so many different boats that are trying to weather reset storm over the next couple of years. And with that, we're just going to close it down. And I want to thank Facebook team. Again, I want to thank Nathalie, Brad for their expert advice. And I want to thank our entire audience for being here in this unusual time on this call virtually. And I hope everyone learned a lot and reminding ourselves that sometimes great minds think unalike.